Canada is facing increased pressure to meet its NATO defense spending targets, or at the very least, to give a date by which it will. There are 18 NATO members who will now meet the agreed-upon minimum requirement of spending 2% of GDP on defense this year. That's up from 11 allies last year. Canada is not among them. I spoke with NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg about that on Power Play this week. Take a listen.
I expect Canada to deliver on the pledge to invest 2% of GDP on defense, because this is a promise we all made. Canada is a big economy.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau responded to that comment, saying this.
We're going to continue to put forward our budgets and our proposals at the appropriate times.
So where does Canada stand with NATO without a specific plan to meet the alliance's target? Julianne Smith is the U.S. ambassador to NATO. Hi, Ambassador. Good to have you back on our program. Thank you for making the time.
Sure. Happy to do it.
How much of your time right now is spent allaying concerns from allies that the U.S. could pull out of NATO, given what former President Donald Trump recently said about encouraging Russia to invade allies that don't spend enough on defense?
Well, I do get questions occasionally, but look, I focus on where the American public is. I don't know if you've seen recent polling, but actually public support for the NATO alliance is up. And U.S. Congress, we see bipartisan delegations come through here almost monthly, and we see deep bipartisan support in Congress for the alliance. U.S. presidents over 7 decades have supported this alliance. I don't expect that to change. I put my faith and trust in the American people and in the U.S. Congress, and continue to explain to American audiences why this alliance matters.
Would your assessment be to, for example, even Canadians listening today, that the U.S. is as committed as ever to NATO?
What I hear from Americans, what I hear from delegations that come through the NATO alliance, what I hear from many corners of the United States is a deep appreciation of why we created NATO in the first place, why it matters today, and why after 75 years it's still relevant to America's security, not only because of what Russia is doing in Ukraine, but because of the whole array of challenges that the alliance is tackling, from space to cyber to emerging and disruptive tech. You know, we have an expression in the United States, this isn't your father's Oldsmobile, and I would say that applies to this alliance.
I do want to ask about one very conventional and severe military threat, and you mentioned it, what's happening in Ukraine. Russia did achieve its first major territorial success last week with the capture of an eastern city. To what degree, in your estimation, is that a result of a lack of the kind of aid from the U.S. that is now stuck in the House?
We do believe that that specific incident could be tied to the fact that the supplemental is still held up in Congress. We have not been able to move forward on additional U.S. assistance to Ukraine, and we believe here at NATO that that assistance is absolutely vital. So we will continue to encourage Congress to move out on that while we applaud the contributions of other NATO allies. But this is something that we'd like to see urgently settled on. This kind of assistance is important, and it's critical to our friends on the ground in Ukraine.
What do you think the consequence of further delay of that aid package will be? If already one city has fallen for the first time in 9 months, what could be next?
Well, obviously, we're very worried about U.S. assistance not coming in short order, because that has real implications on the ground for those Ukrainian soldiers that are fighting each and every day. We don't want to see any additional Russian gains. We want the lines to be moving in the other direction. But we're also encouraging other partners and allies to continue to offer air defense, which is critically needed, and ammunition, which we're seeing shortages of.
Speaking of other allies and their role, not only in the context of what's happening in Ukraine, but more largely in NATO, I do want to ask you about Canada. I interviewed Mr. Stoltenberg just a few days ago, and he told me he expects Canada to meet the NATO target of 2% of GDP on defense spending. Do you share that view?
Absolutely. We came together as an alliance. Every member of this alliance sat down 10 years ago and said that we would move to the 2% target, which is for each member to spend 2% of their GDP on defense. Over the last 10 years, we've moved from 3 countries meeting that target to 18, with more to come. And those that aren't meeting it right now have a plan to get there, except for Canada. So we very much want our friends in Canada to keep moving towards the 2% target. target, but most importantly, we want them to lay out a plan to get there so that we can celebrate the moment when all allies hit the 2% target. Ultimately, as we all know, collective security is not free. It requires all of us to make tough choices, but to invest in our own national defense. And we very much appreciate all that Canada is doing for Ukraine and to support other NATO missions, but we need Canadians to invest in their own defense to lift up what all of us are trying to do here at NATO.
Why is setting a date so important, and what does it convey to allies that Canada has yet to do so?
Setting a date is important because it shows intent, and it shows that the government has a real plan, and it shows a commitment to the pledge that we all made in 2014. Every other member of the alliance has said we will meet it by 2024 or a few years later. But just saying in more broad terms that you're working towards it, I think lacks the commitment that we want to see on the part of our friends in Canada. So it's very important for them to lay out a plan to get there, to then meet what other allies are doing. Every ally is moving to try and meet this target, and so we want our friends in Canada to do the same.
The federal government here will point to fiscal constraints that exist right now, a tightened fiscal environment because of a host of different factors. The deficit we run in this country is much scalar on a proportionate basis versus, much smaller, pardon me, on a proportionate basis versus what the U.S. does. How do you respond to concerns about adding $15 billion, for example, a year over the next 4 years to our deficit?
Every single member of this alliance has its own domestic politics, it has its own history, it has its own complicated relationship between the finance minister and the defense minister. We all face unique challenges in this area of defense spending, but given everything that's going on in the world, not just what Russia is doing in Ukraine, but PRC attempts to weaken the NATO alliance or weaken the transatlantic bond, what we're seeing with Iranian and DPRK support for what Russia is doing right now, the world has become an increasingly dangerous place, and that requires all of us to make some tough choices and invest in our own national defense. We appreciate that this isn't easy, and I applaud all of the increases that the Canadian government has already made, but inching just above 1.3% is a long way from 2%. So we'd like to see some intent. We'd like to see that planning to eventually get to 2%.
Ambassador, I'll leave it there. I do appreciate your time today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.